Okay, hello everyone. Please let me welcome you to today's Space Security Guest Lecture that is organized by the Prague Security Studies Institute in collaboration with Charles University's Department of Security Studies within the course of Space Security. Prague Security Studies Institute is a non-profit, non-governmental organization with an aim to help safeguard and reinforce individual freedoms and democratic institutions, and seeks to illuminate select unconventional threats arising from authoritarian governments that challenge the transatlantic alliance and other partners globally. Today, it is my great honor to welcome among us Dr. Regina Peldszus, a space policy officer at the European External Action Service, who will deliver her guest lecture entitled Space Security and EU Perspective. The whole bio of Dr. Peldszus can be found on our website. Dr. Peldszus, thank you very much for being with us today. Before we begin, just a short technical note. During the lecture, you all have the opportunity to ask the questions through the questions and answer option that can be found at the bottom of your screen. After the lecture, I will mediate your questions to Dr. Peldszus. I believe we will have enough time to answer as many questions as possible, so please do not hesitate to write them down. That would be all from my side for now. And now, Dr. Peldszus, if you are ready, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jakub, and thank you to also Jana and Patrick, the organizers at PSSI, for your invite and your kind invitation for a perspective of the European Union on space security. And of course, space security is something that you in the audience are studying, and you're starting to join the community of space security scholars or security scholars with an interest beyond maybe your specialty, but I also know that we have some colleagues in the audience who have been steeped for years and decades in this domain of space security, and I'm really delighted to be with you tonight. And in particular, I'd like to share some thoughts on ongoing and recent efforts of space security in the EU, where my specific vantage point is as part of the team in the European External Action Service that supports the EU Special Envoy for Space. And she in turn advises the High Representative on Foreign and Security Policy of the EU, Borrell. And most recently, the HR and the Commission, together with the Commission, we have been concentrating on our efforts on developing and then now implementing a EU space security strategy for security defense. And you may have noticed that this came out earlier this year, and I will touch upon some elements here. But since we do not have all evening, I'd like to focus specifically on one area that is very critical to us and important, and which can also be considered one of the prerequisites of understanding the space environment and what's going on in space, but also acting within space and through it, because you know that space is an area where we have infrastructure and an area also where we're active in our various roles. So space situational awareness. With this overall angle, I would like to highlight a few key recent developments and activities and how they relate to space security and also to our recent strategic reflections. But I also want to highlight a few of the principles that underpin our thinking, that underpin our policy work, and that also underpin some of our more operational activities in this field. And so my first slide, if I may have the next slide, please. Thank you. My next slide shows you a little bit of an outline on how we understand the space domain and how it's been changing since the end of the Cold War and in the past 5 to 10 years specifically. And I want to highlight a few of the things that we understand of the space domain, the way we see it, the way we frame it also, which helps us to and provides the fundamental basis of how we then design and develop our policies and implement our policies and programs. So you may have heard that space is regarded by some, at least in the European Union, we regard it as a global commons. That means it is an area that we understand belongs to everybody, and you cannot simply own it, but you kind of want to safeguard it for everybody and strive for cooperation in your activities in this domain. Of course, you know it's very a hostile environment in terms of physical characteristics. It's very inaccessible, and we require huge effort to get into space or put satellites or other objects into space. But we regard it as an area that we want to safeguard for future use for ourselves, for future generations, also for other actors that are currently not yet spacefaring. We have, of course, a number of infrastructure in the domain. In this domain, I'll talk about this a little bit later. We use it not just as a area that we want to preserve, but also as an area that's really critical to our everyday lives, where we have guidance, navigation, control infrastructure, Galileo, or satellite navigation system, for instance, or Earth observation program, Copernicus. And we really have, we're really using it as almost like a medium, as a site for this infrastructure. At the same time, not only most recently with the geopolitical environment that's been changing a lot for us, but also in prior to last year, we've begun to look at it as a strategic domain, as a domain that is increasingly relevant for security defense missions, a domain that's increasingly an area where security relevant activities happen, not just that we use it for this purpose, but also that this could be a site of events that have an implication on security defense. So this is the overall, let's say, the two frames, and you can see a kind of duality here, and I'm going to touch upon this a little bit later as well, and what that means for us. But so we see it as a global commons and as a strategic domain, these two things. At the same time, you will have heard already from many of the other colleagues that may have spoken to you, we see a huge increase in the diversity of actors that are active in the space domain. There are increased a number of state actors that are spacefaring or that are using space assets and space data, but we also see a huge commercial footprint. And I think you've all been following developments that are not just confined to the interest of those active in the space area per se, but really have come into the public sphere and the public conscience with commercial satellites and mega constellations and actors that are active in this domain. And if you look at these type of mega constellations, we understand that there's a proliferation of objects. So we have a huge increase of objects in space. And with an object, of course, we mean satellites, but we also mean debris when a satellite has broken up or been destroyed or been damaged in some other way into fragments. So we have a huge increase in objects, human-made and from accidental collisions. We see a huge miniaturization of objects. That means the satellites that we put into orbit are ever smaller, self-similar, but also much smaller, so much different from the exquisite, very big satellites that we used to put in space, in the first 50 years of space exploration and space utilization. And we also see that the objects that we now have, especially when we look at mega constellations, are aggregated. So often they are flying in formation or they're organized in fleets. So they're not just distinct, discrete little objects, but they're really, part of infrastructure that is bound together. And also with these, in addition to the hostility of the space environment that I briefly mentioned, this huge increase in objects also means that we have an increasing risks, especially operational hazards. So for instance, you have satellites that could be colliding, you have debris that could be impacting on a satellite or other space infrastructure that you have. And we have to increasingly devote a huge portion of our time, and with we, I mean the community of space operators or those states and organizations that operate satellites. We have to devote a huge amount of our efforts in avoiding collisions and in making sure that our infrastructure is safeguarded. And also, aside from these operational hazards, at risk we have novel threats. We have a huge increase in types of technologies that are used for many useful things, but can also be used as by way of threatening other assets. We have a increase in ways that satellites can maneuver, so they're much more active and versatile and agile than they used to be. So we see a lot of threats in the space domain. And I want to just sketch this as an overall outline of the environment of how it's, we're sitting now at a paradigm change for it. And this environment is what we're all looking at and what we're all acting within when we talk about space security as different state and non-state actors. And this is also how we see it when we look at space security as the European Union and especially the European External Action Service. Next slide, please. And I briefly, if you recall, I highlighted this distinction between the global commons and the strategic domain, and also operational risks and hazards and operational threats that we see in space. And thank you. And that means we have a intersection or an interplay or this duality of safety and security. And I want to speak a little bit about what that means, because it underpins very much of our thinking and our development of policy and strategy. So I mentioned the point on, for instance, providing collision avoidance for satellites because they maybe collide. So for us, this is a risk. It is not an intentional threat. So it's essentially something that we regard as a safety problem or a safety challenge that we need to address. And that resonates a lot with this idea of congested, of having so many different objects that we need to be able to manage or coordinate this amount of objects. So this for us is safety. It relates a lot to the congested nature of space. On the other hand, and I will speak about the relationship in a little bit, but on the other hand, we have security-related elements. So the space environment is something that we understand as contested and competitive. That means we're not really looking just at risk of space debris or collisions, but we're really looking at an increase in intentional threats and intentionally contesting or denying someone the use of space or putting their assets at risk intentionally. So we have this duality of safety and security, and that resonates a lot with this threefold dictum of space being congested, contested, and competitive. And this, as you may recall, is a frame or as a way to describe the space environment that actually originated in the US, I think in an Armed Service Committee in 2011. But it has since been taken up also on our side to, as caught on in a way to describe the environment. And for us, it really maps onto these both sides. So I want to just highlight that we have two sides to the space environment when we're looking at safety and security. And especially in Europe, I want to highlight that, if we look at different languages, I don't know what it's like in Czech, but in certain languages, the two concepts are the same, and that provides us with a lot of opportunity for reflection, thinking, but also to be, of terminological discussions and to be really sure that we're talking about the same thing. And I want to really focus today on the security side. However, I will start by doing that by actually showing the other side very briefly and also highlighting what the intersections could be. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, just to show again a quote from our foreign policy chief. Space is becoming increasingly congested due to a huge increase in satellites and space debris, and this puts at risk our space infrastructure and space services. This was last year at the European Space Policy Conference, and I think this set the scene for some work that came out last year, which relates to the safety side, to the congested, addressing the congestion of space. I could have the next slide. Regarding our EU programs, I briefly highlighted Galileo and Copernicus. We have two fleets, but we also have increasingly, we're working, oh, you can go back, thank you. We're increasingly working with other partners, and we understand that we need to safeguard what we have, the infrastructure that we're operating in space. Next slide, please. So on this safety side, the EU recognized that it is becoming a global problem or a global challenge that we have this huge increase in objects. I think we now have between 5,000 and 6,000 objects that are operational in space. a large majority is commercial, and basically we are looking at increasing risk of collisions between those fleets, but also within them. And the EU recognized this issue of congestion as a global challenge and issued a proposal for an approach for space traffic management last year. And this was the first time where the foreign policy side, foreign policy chief, and the Commission worked together on a so-called joint communication, which is a format of proposals in the EU. And we basically have been implementing this, and I want to just briefly highlight this because it is a civilian and a safety issue for us, avoiding collisions, avoiding space debris, making sure that infrastructure remains safe. But at the same time, although it is a safety issue for us, it has a couple of security angles. On the one hand, we want to take into account the military perspective, especially of military operators. If you think back to the overall number of objects in space, I think these 5,600 satellites, 300 of them, roughly a little bit more, are operated by the militaries of the world. So we do have military satellites that we also need to safeguard, that have specific missions that are quite exquisite, fulfilling certain security defense missions. So they may not be able to maneuver or move in the same way as other satellites, not in terms of physics, but really in terms of rules and in who we want to evade a conjunction when two objects are approaching each other because they have a very specific mission. So we want to take into account the military perspective of military satellite operators, but we also recognize, and I will talk about this later on, when I talk about space situational awareness in more detail, we also rely on many of the same sensor assets, so radars, telescopes that are looking at the sky, that are looking into different orbital regimes to understand where objects are, which is then how we compute and make collision avoidance, but also can see other things and also are used for different purposes. So I just wanted to highlight this. So if you retain one thing, this is safety related, and space traffic management is a huge area that we're working on, but it is something that we really see on the safety side with some security implications, but it addresses this overall environment. Now, when we look at security, imagine that everything that happens on a security side is happening against this backdrop of this huge increase of objects and the challenge that's already quite steep and quite difficult to implement space traffic management or space traffic coordination, whatever you want to call it, with global partners, with others across industry, across governments. So all of this is the backdrop against which anything that's happening in security unfolds. So we have a huge complexity in that domain. If I could have the next slide, please. So that's why we have not only the congested part, but we also have contested. So again, I want to quote Borrell from a much more recent speech where he looked at the upcoming EU space security defense strategy, and where he recognized that due to geopolitical competition that we have, and which is now increasingly projected in space through space threats, he basically argued for the need for preparation for a competitive and contested space environment. So you see these two elements happening in the same environment, and I think that's one of the key issues to bear in mind, this complexity and this intertwinedness of risks and threats in this domain. Next slide, please. And he was echoing points that had already been foreshadowed by the European member states in a very important strategy document that they issued in 2022, which is the Strategic Compass for Security Defense. And this is really a collection of strategic reflections and guidance that the 27 member states worked on and elaborated and then published themselves together, which is a huge feat of coordination to highlight in various domains, not just in space, but really across different environments and domains, what their guidance and lines of efforts in security defense should be in the coming years. And this strategic compass acknowledged in its space section that our freedom of action depends on a safe, secure, autonomous access to the space domain. We need to be prepared for a more competitive and contested space environment. Due to our increasing dependency on space systems and services, we are more vulnerable to irresponsible and threatening behavior by strategic competitors. I want to dissect this a little bit. I'll talk a little bit, a bit about the space domain. We've already highlighted what contested means for us. And you would know very well that we have an increasing use and increasing reliance for our economies and societies on space systems and space services. For instance, the data that we get from space, the navigation data that you use on your phones, the images that you're using from space for navigation or for understanding, where we are. So we're using this all the time. Our economies rely on this. Our financial sectors, our utility sectors, our transport sectors, agriculture, all of these sectors really depend on it. And this, and the strategic compass acknowledged this. This, of course, also creates vulnerabilities, as a derivative also of the different risks that we're seeing in the space domain that I just highlighted earlier. So I want to talk a little bit about the space domain and in the coming few slides, but I also want you to retain one point, not just on threats, but on irresponsible behavior. And we'll come back to this later on, but if you retain this, maybe we'll come back to this later on. Next slide, please. So what is the space domain for us? Earlier in the slide, I highlighted, the different trends that are impacting the space environment that we currently see. But we see those affected on a range of elements that for us constitute the space domain. And I'm taking this here now as the definition from the EU Space Security and Defense Strategy, where we say that the space domain includes all the different elements that are relevant for the functioning of space systems and the delivery of space-based services, for instance, Earth observation or navigation, including the physical space environment, which we know has extremely hostile temperature ranges, radiation, physicalities of moving around, so very extreme. We have different orbits. If you think about lower Earth orbit, medium, and geosynchronous orbit, but also highly elliptical orbit. So we have different ranges in space, of course, and the different spacecraft that we have in there, satellites, but also space stations that are inhabited, which we shouldn't forget. And of course, the ground and the launch infrastructure, sometimes called the ground segment, which is related to the operation of these systems. And of course, the different links between them. So the data that's exchanged between space and ground, which is often the sole reason of having something in space, that you get the data, but also it's used for commanding different space assets. But we also, so we see all of these, we see everything that's in space, everything on the ground segment, from control centers to launch sites to tracking antennas. But we also see the cyber environment. I think that's very important, and we'll come back to this again when we talk about threats a little bit, but also the underlying space sector. And I think that's something that in the past we've acknowledged, but we haven't really related it directly to the hardware of space, because of course it's related also to the industrial base and economy. But increasingly, this is really also becoming a very, very important element that we see that is critical for the safety and also the security of or resilience and security of our the space domain. Next slide, please. And one of the points that the strategy makes in the beginning, it has several pillars, and I don't really want to go into all of them today, but really pick one area out that is important, especially to us, which is the response to space threats that we are increasingly seeing in the environment, and how space situational awareness can relate to this. And we propose in this strategy that we look at all the different threats in the space domain, which could affect the security of the EU and its member states. That means not just our space assets, but also the security on the ground, which could be affected through the disruption of space assets. We want to look at exercises more. I will talk about this a little bit, including to test the mechanisms that we have in place, but also to look at collaboration and solidarity between the different EU member states in case of space threats. And we want to enhance space domain awareness to ensure that we detect and then ultimately also prepare response to space threats. And I will go through these points in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So on space threats, we in the strategy, we are calling for an annual space threat assessment, which will be prepared by the relevant agencies in Europe. But we also highlight already the type of threats that we see and how they map onto the space domain. And I already highlighted earlier, we really see the space segment, the ground segment, but also the link between the two. And we map onto the different categories of counter space capabilities that we know in development and testing, and in some cases already being deployed. So the main categories you see on the right, many of you will be already familiar with space threat taxonomies. There are some excellent analyses and reports and thinking that come out every year from different think tanks and academia, but also from different agencies. And I think I just want to highlight very briefly, different categories such as direct descent, anti-satellite systems that are launched from the ground, but go directly into space, co-orbital assets, ASAT, that are in space already, they're deployed there, and then after a while they become active. And that could range from anything from, arms or robotic arms, or also little nested, objects or projectiles, whatever you want to imagine there. We are also looking at directed energy, so dazzling, blinding, use of lasers, microwave, or high altitude nuclear detonations. And there were also electronic and cyber elements, especially jamming and spoofing of signals, for instance, of navigation timing signals, and in terms of cyber interception, corruption, or even the takeover of a satellite. And the final bit, cyber, is very important. I would encourage you to look into this if you have a penchant for cyber. Cyber is one of the lowest threshold and possibly most very disruptive counter space capabilities that are being used, and they're quite pervasive and not very easy to attribute. So I think that's a very important category for us currently and also in the future. And these different categories of counter space technologies can be used in different ways. It depends, of course, what we do with them. You can use them offensively, defensively. The effect that you elicit with one of those can be reversible or irreversible and cause damage that you can go back. For instance, if you dazzle someone or jam somebody's signal, this is, if we can go back, please. That wouldn't necessarily be something that you cannot reverse, but if you strike somebody's asset with a direct descent ASAT, which is essentially a missile, then this is more disruptive and cannot be reversed, and also has a lot of collateral damage. And these categories are employed to deny, deceive, disrupt, degrade, or destroy, depending on what you're using them for. So what do we do in face of such threats in general? Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier we want to enhance the space threat response that we have, or the strategy calls for that. We already have a mechanism that we're building on, which is called the space threat response architecture that we are implementing in the EU. And this is basically if you're interested in the kind of legal basis for this, it's a council decision that highlights that the High Representative, our foreign policy chief, has the responsibility and the duty to avert a threat to the security of the Union or to one of or more of its member states, and to mitigate serious harm to the interests that we have if they arise from the deployment or the operation or the use of space systems and services that will operate under the EU space program, so the flagships Galileo, Copernicus, and soon also IRIS Square, the communication fleet. And in the event of a threat to this infrastructure or to the operation of those systems, we have a mechanism that can be put into place that links essentially the operational part, people in the security monitoring centers, to the overall decision makers in order to mitigate and to find a response by reconfiguring, by safeguarding the system, essentially. Next slide, please. And that means in this mechanism, which we abbreviate as CD698, which is the name of the council decision, we basically bring together, in an event of that, it triggers a procedure that you can read in this council decision that mobilizes all the different political, diplomatic, and technical actors in case of an incident, from the Galileo Security Monitoring Center to the High Representative, their representation, and the council. So everybody comes together, discusses, and can take, because we have a procedure for this, very rather swift decision on how to safeguard this infrastructure, which is then being implemented by the operational part again. So it's a loop that goes from operations to political decision maker back to operations, taking into account the environment. We test this every year through an annual exercise. You have to kind of exercise these kind of mechanisms, where we basically simulate that an EU space asset or infrastructure is subject to attack, which targets an essential or critical service that we cannot do without. And for instance, last year, we were building on a scenario that resonated with, that used the scenario of the then French exercise Asterix in 2022. So we're sharing a lot of expertise there with some of the member states. And this mechanism will now be, in the coming years, will be extended to other parts of the space program. Currently, it is directly related to Galileo, which you can also see here on the picture, but it will be covering also other parts of the EU space infrastructure, notably Copernicus, and then in future also the upcoming constellation of IRIS Square. And when I say response or responding to the space threat or the space threat response mechanism, we need to be quite precise and recall that this is not a response that is intrinsically about attribution. It is really a technical response to safeguard the system. And we'll talk a little bit about how this can be enhanced in the coming few minutes. Next slide, please. Because if you want to attribute, this is essentially a political decision. So you can gather. You can fulfill the security monitoring function of your assets, but if you want to detect a threat and then ultimately attribute, this is something where you need additional types of technology and ultimately a political decision-making process for attribution to a certain source. And one of the ways that we want to approach this is to invest more in space situational awareness and more space domain awareness. And I will highlight how these are perhaps a little bit distinct and how, where the genesis of these two development lies in our case. So if you recall the strategy document I mentioned earlier, the strategic compass of the EU, that already highlighted that due to the changing threat environment and the increasing risks and complexity and also intentional threats, we want to invest more in space situational awareness to better understand and reduce space-based risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. So there is already a call from the member states in this joint strategic reflection that we need better space situational awareness in order to reduce risks, the safety side that I mentioned earlier, but also to reduce threats and vulnerabilities. And we don't have time to go into detail tonight, and there are many other wonderful colleagues that could be speaking to this. We have a program called EU Space Surveillance and Tracking, which is currently constituting the, let's say, SSA or SST capability in the European Union. It's part of the EU space program. So there's a space situational awareness program, which has a large subcomponent for space surveillance and tracking. which is done by a consortium of currently 15 member states. There's two smaller subcomponents for space weather, understanding the space weather environment, and also near-Earth objects that are non-human made objects approaching the Earth, could be potentially hazardous. These two components are delegated to ESA as part of that. So we have an SSA program and an SST capability, and this SST capability for space surveillance and tracking is currently providing, I think, nearly 400 users at the moment in Europe with collision avoidance services. So you'll recall earlier the point on space traffic management, where this is the operational element of, if we want to do space traffic management, we need to do collision avoidance. So this is what they do. But, and the reason I'm bringing this up here, the type of sensors that we use for this, I mentioned earlier, we also use to understand not just the location of objects and their trajectory and if they're going to be colliding, but also, other types of behavior or what they're doing and other characteristics of space assets. And that's why that's more space domain awareness. So we really want to be aware of what is occurring in the space domain in terms of security relevance. And usually this term is used in the military, and of course, the different space commands in Europe that have been set up in the last few years, the space domain awareness mission or effort is with them. And the idea is in Europe to understand how we can collaborate or share on some of the elements that give us a greater awareness of the space domain. And the space strategy for security defense defines this as consisting of detecting, identifying, and characterizing space objects, so satellites, other objects of interest in near real time, so you need to be quite accurate, by describing and also understanding their behaviors and connecting this information to underlying doctrines and related space systems. So I think it's quite important that and we're beginning to see objects not only in their, as discrete elements that are doing something and maybe interacting with others, but really as part of the value systems and of the overall plans and programs of other space actors. So if you're looking at, if you're analyzing a threat, of course, that's relevant information, not just to understand what is the system doing. Can you see, for instance, with a certain sensor that this object is now two objects, or this object now is deploying a certain instrument that you have not been aware of beforehand, but really what that means and how you, and what it means in the context of the overall capability that actor to whom this space asset belongs, if would be able to command. So next slide, please. And this is really important because we need to understand this in order to be able to attribute. And if we do not have this type of awareness, we would be relying on information that either is made available through partners and allies. And of course, in the area of SSA and SST, we depend in Europe, and also the European member states depend to a very large degree on data provided by the US military. But we also sometimes look at, sometimes if something security relevant in space happens, sometimes this is also claimed directly by the adversary who says, yes, I tested this and this system, or yes, that was me. But it's very important to understand the overall situation and also to understand the different systems in order to begin to understand and to describe in view of a attribution process. And without it, you wouldn't be able to react or respond in a timely, proportionate, and coherent manner. Next slide, please. And one element that is very important in that context that I want to highlight is, we looked, is the question of intent. So we say, okay, we have an environment, we have lots of different things that can happen in it, capabilities that are happening, and we can maybe detect and see something. Maybe we can even characterize something and say, yes, we can definitely see that there's someone that is grappling another spacecraft and then moving it away into a different orbit. But what does that mean? And what was the intent behind it? An intent is something that is very difficult to establish if you don't have a statement saying, with this action, I have intended to do this and that, by the party or by the actor that's the primary actor in this event. So we need to understand intent, and that's very difficult and requires a huge amount of dedication and context, and maybe very difficult. And essentially, it consists of interpreting events, taken into account not just the context, but also the type of behavior and that a object is taken on. And this is difficult because, as you may already have reflected upon as part of your course, is that space technology is inherently dual. So much space technology can be used for different purposes, civilian or military or peaceful and peaceful and non-peaceful, depending on the type of nomenclature and interpretation that you follow. But essentially that means, for instance, you have a missile, you can use a missile as a launcher to put satellites in orbit. And these satellites can then monitor agriculture or ocean salinity, but you can also use a missile to destroy another satellite, or you can also use a satellite for intelligence collection purposes, or you can use it, which is not per se military, of course, but you can also use it for support of military operations. And of course, you have different payloads that you have on satellites. And I would highlight here, for instance, something that's becoming very important because we have such a congested environment, but also where we see a lot of very interesting commercial activity is, the area of proximity operations, approaching another satellite and using certain instruments like arms or, other type of grappling or connection devices to connect to other objects, not just, in this case for active debris removal, for instance, and cleaning up space, preventing space debris, and enhancing the lifetime of satellites. So you can use that kind of rendezvous and proximity operations technology for that, but you can also use it to, if it doesn't happen with consent, to grapple another adversary satellites or tug away someone else's asset. So you see different, the different purposes and different uses of the same type of technology. And what's extremely important in that context, and that helps us also to begin to approach intent, is to have transparency, to avoid miscalculation and misinterpretation, because you don't want to do something, maybe with someone else's consent, but somebody, you connect together and you tug an object away in order to deorbit it because it's space debris, but somebody sees it and thinks you're testing a new anti-satellite system. So we want to have a huge amount of transparency that you can either express as the party and the actor that is putting this event, putting this technology in place and executing this event of, for instance, docking with another asset. But this transparency can also be fulfilled by having sensors that are looking at the sky and can observe and monitor this at this event. So you can do both, of course. And ideally, we have this transparency in order to make sure that we don't have any miscalculation or misinterpretation. And so you recall earlier when I mentioned, we want to prevent or not be put at risk from irresponsible behavior. And I think this notion of responsible or irresponsible behavior is very important. I mean, I've just highlighted why behavior is important, not just what the capability is, but what you do with that capability. And I think that's why it's very important that you use this capability responsibly and you signal and that you are transparent and that you are responsible in what you do and how far and how close you come to someone, for instance, in the fact that you don't create debris when you're doing certain things, but also that you signal and that you're quite transparent. So this is the type of responsible behavior that we want to see, and this is what we mean by the behavioral approach that like-minded partners have in the UN, and which the EU is also supporting in the UN, and which the special envoy and our colleagues who are working, especially on the multilateral side, are really working very hard to support. And you may have heard of the UN resolution to reduce space threats to responsible behavior. This is something that the EU has supported very much, and which has ongoing discussions currently in an open-ended working group in Geneva. So if you're interested in the multilateral side in UN, I would encourage you to look at the work that Geneva is doing and that is happening in the UN on that side to reduce threats through responsible behavior. Because if we're responsible, if we're transparent, if we don't create debris, then that constitutes responsible behavior, and that can prevent miscalculation and unintended escalation. Next slide, please. And since I just mentioned the multilateral side, I want to briefly highlight some of the collaborative lines of efforts that we have highlighted also in the strategy, but that also underpin much of our other policy work, not just on the multilateral side, but also for what I mentioned earlier with space traffic management. But for space security defense, our partners are, the United Nations, where we support a common understanding and approach to space security in view of the promotion of responsible behaviors. I just talked about this. We also work and want to continue to deepen our partnership with the US for space security defense in a mutually beneficial way. That means we want to share the burden more on these kind of issues and not just rely on one partner to, for instance, help us safeguard our infrastructure with the data that they share on space objects, but really also take our share of the burden and also be supportive, have a two-way partnership. And the third one is to engage also with others, with other third countries beyond the US, in space security dialogues. This is a discussion format that we have for bilateral exchanges with the US, but also with others. For instance, Japan, more recently, our director also highlighted in Australia, and the Commission President highlighted in Australia that we want to have more of a dialogue with them, but on space in general. So there are many others that we have bilateral engagements with, but also want to deepen this. And I think what's really important is to talk not only to like-minded partners or nations, but also to those others that are not yet involved directly in our space partnerships, but that are already using space data, including of the EU, because many of the services are accessible beyond the European Union to many other partners. And I think to bring everybody on board and to bring everyone to the table to be able to have approaches and solutions that are lasting very long, both from the global commons and the strategic domain perspective. And finally, just a very short note on which is also included in the strategy is the deepening of EU-NATO cooperation on space security and defense through regular exchanges. As you know, the European Union actually owns space infrastructure. NATO relies on the infrastructures given through the member states of NATO. And of course, we recognize that NATO is the primary security partner for the member states. But I think for space, there's a lot of cooperation that can be explored. If you're interested in this, I would encourage you to look at the strategy, at the document, and delve deeper into some of these issues, whether it be partnerships or threat response, but also some of the other areas that our colleagues in the Commission are particularly working on in terms of resilience, but also capabilities. Next slide, please. And with this, I would like to begin to conclude This year, I think we've been very active in space security, and I think this marks the starting point of much more engagement in that context. And I want to leave you with a quote of the High Representative again from a recent speech, which asks whether we are essentially prepared if there's a hostile act in space or an irresponsible act in space that targets a European Union satellite. This may happen. And of course, this is not a rhetorical question, because of course we want to be prepared and we want to prepare infrastructure. But I think we are increasingly now cognizant of the fact that we also need to put the requisite tools in place and join the tools that we already have and the repertoire of mechanisms and capabilities and actors that are involved in this in the European Union. And if you think back to the first point I made on the changing environment in space, we see ourselves now, and this is also something that the HRBP highlighted, at an inflection point or at a paradigm change. And I think it's really important to understand what this paradigm change means, to understand the environment as we then begin to fill our efforts with capabilities and budgets and policies. And that's why I wanted to focus today on awareness, of being aware what is happening, being aware how this slots into the existing environment in space. And I think to you as an upcoming generation of security scholars, this will be the environment that you will be inheriting and entering, and that you will also be beginning to shape as you embark on your career in space security, some of you, I hope. But even if, of course, if you don't choose to work in space security per se, I think it's very important to bear in mind that space has become such a pervasive and critical element of our societies and economies, and certainly also of geopolitical interactions, that there will be, even if you work outside the space domain per se, a lot of intersections and many, many implications between the two. So I encourage you to further explore some of the points, if you found them interesting, that I mentioned today, but also to go perhaps and read the EU Space Security and Defense Strategy, and also look at all the work that we're doing in the European Union with the many institutions and agencies that we cooperate with on the External Action Service side, whether that's the European Commission with their space program, or the European Satellite Center for Geospatial Intelligence Analysis, and of course, the European Space Program Agency in Prague. And with this, I think we can go to my very final thank you slide. And I thank you for bearing with me for this brief hour. And I understand that we now have opportunity for questions and comments. And I'd certainly be very interested and delighted also to hear from you what you think and what your questions may be, but also maybe your comments on what this environment currently is and that you will be working on or interacting with in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina, for your talk that touched upon many interesting and important issues related to the space security of the EU. Maybe I will kick off with the first question, because you mentioned this new EU space security defense strategy, and you also briefly mentioned this irresponsible behavior and responsible actors. So my question would be, considering that the new EU space strategy emphasizes the promotion of norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors in outer space, what should be the EU approach to the space actors that actually act irresponsibly and can undermine those efforts?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think maybe I would highlight 2 points here. On the one hand, the substance that response can take, but also on the other hand, how to organize it. And I think one thing that we need to bear in mind, which is very important for security defense, certainly for the defense side and for responses, is that we're really talking about something here that will be done in conjunction with the member states. So the member states have a huge role here in deciding together and in collaborating. And remember, it's 27 that need to be of one mind, essentially to, for instance, explore the repertoire, put in place a repertoire and enhance it, but also then to use it. And this repertoire currently consists of, a technical response, but also of looking at safeguarding the system, but also at economic measures such as sanctions, diplomatic tools that can be used. So I think there's a range of elements, but I would highlight always that we have a lot of issues that are also a part of the sovereign remit of member states in this context, especially when we're looking at security, defense, and space.
Thank you. If we move to the questions from the audience, we actually have 2 questions here. And the first is, what is being done to remove space debris? And I think I already mentioned this next question because I think it from a certain angle it's closely related to this. And that is, to what extent is improved maneuverability of space assets a reasonable requirement for modest economic actors?
Can you repeat the second part?
To what extent is improved maneuverability of space assets a reasonable requirement for modest space economic actors?
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's a really important point. Maybe I would highlight again, so let's look at debris removal. For us, debris is really a safety issue. Having said that, debris can also be generated by a kinetic direct descent ASAT, for instance. We've seen in 2021 in November the most recent anti-satellite test in this case by the Russian Federation, which generated a significant amount of debris. So there is, let's say, a debris or safety angle in a security relevant event. And then, we since had the self-commitment of the US and many others to not commit these type of tests, but we do have debris. And on the one hand, I would recall that this is the environment that we're in. So we have increasing amounts of objects, increasing amount of debris. So against this operational risk, anything that's happening in security is unfolding. But of course, there are efforts in the EU in the European Union, but also the member states and also the European Space Agency to look at technologies of how to remove debris. I think there are many interesting concepts also in industry on different ways to approach, but also then to grapple or catch or to attract other issues. And I think if you're interested in this, look at active debris removal, ADR, which is using several capabilities, including what I mentioned earlier, rendezvous and proximity operations. So where you rendezvous and then you get very close to, or you get close and then you rendezvous with the satellite. You have to kind of attract them. And then, for instance, tug them away and they burn up in the atmosphere, or you resurface them and, for instance, replenish their fuel so that you extend the lifetime and prevent them from becoming debris sooner rather than later. So there are different ways, to remove debris, and I would encourage you to look at active debris removal. And it's an important area also in the European space regulation. There are a couple of points on this in the space surveillance and tracking subcomponent to look at development of debris mitigation and remediation. Another point and you're completely right in relating the 2 questions, is improved maneuverability. That means, of course, if you can maneuver your satellite, which not all satellites can, but if you can maneuver your satellite, that means you can avoid a collision, or if your satellite is in conjunction with with another satellite, with a different asset. If you cannot maneuver and the other object can maneuver, then they most likely will, if the risk of collision is very high. And at the same time, that costs them, fuel, and that costs them a lot of planning, maybe losing them time that they were actually spending executing their mission with their payload, which may be taking pictures of the ground, for instance, for Earth observation satellites, or doing communication services. So I think for new actors, it's quite important to be able to respond in some way to conjunction events, and that's most likely to maneuver through maneuvering. So non-maneuverable satellites, I think, require our attention, definitely, but I think for new actors entering the space domain, there are ways to maneuver. And I think there are many new technologies from electric propulsion, for instance, that are, sorry, I'm having notifications, that are ushering in have ushered in a new area of how to maneuver in space. I think it's an important element. But I would also maybe defer to the technical expertise of spacecraft engineers to really look at what you can do with maneuvering. And in the end, I would say maneuvering is one element of avoiding another satellite, but you also need the communication channels and possibly the rules-based regime or some kind of rules on how to avoid each other. And I think that's all part of also of space traffic management, the technical elements, operational elements, but also the rules and other elements, communicating part of that.
Thank you so much for this exhausting answer. Shall I have some new question here? And that is that the EU's upcoming IRIS-2 constellation is supposed to be dual use by design, meaning it could be used by militaries in both peacetime and conflict. How does the EU plan to ensure that civilian services will not be affected by military uses and their consequences?
It's an excellent question. I cannot speak to it in detail because this is currently, as you know, in discussion on the EU level. I think maybe a general note on dual use technology is that you can use dual use as a way to characterize a technology and understand for which purpose it is being used, but you can also, and this is increasingly also happening on the EU side, you can exploit the fact that this is dual and ensure that you don't duplicate efforts of having, for instance, two separate types of satellites that are doing the same thing but for different purposes. So I think I would encourage you to follow the discussion closely. I think this year will be quite interesting for anyone who's interested in IRIS², but also maybe in the meantime look at the capabilities section of this strategy and look particularly into the way this is addressing dual use technology.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question here. I'm not really sure if I understand it correctly, but it's that to what extent could you use the Russian actions towards Starlink satellites assisting Ukraine as a proxy for the Russian policy towards EU-NATO satellites? So, yeah.
I think, yes, I think if we followed, the publicly available information, this has been one of the very interesting and for some also quite surprising developments in the last year. We've seen a lot of dependency on space systems through the use of communication satellites. I think our policy makers have certainly highlighted the fact that we that these types of capability are really provided people in a war and a crisis zone with important means of connection, for instance. What I would maybe highlight is to look at at other cases, for instance, the Viasat case, where in the eve of the Russian invasion, we saw Viasat terminals being disrupted, which had also a knock-on effect on other types of infrastructure in one of the member states, and which was a cyber attack essentially. So I think we see a lot of we see that this is increasingly being used in crisis environments, and I think it's important to see what the intent behind is. And I think maybe if we go back to what was happening on the multilateral side in the UN, I think Russia has expressed that they see that commercial satellites can be a target, and I think it's now up to us, and I think increasingly also together between state actors and non-state actors to really thrash out how this how they can work together on not only protecting themselves but also to how certain disruptions of certain infrastructure that must not necessarily belong to a state actor, how this will be dealt with in a crisis situation or in a conflict situation.
Thank you. And I think it's a time for the last question that we are having here, and that is, what is the perception of the EU as an ally of the USA to the increasing rivalry between the USA and China in space?
I think currently the EU is, reviewing or like looking at its the way it sees China. I think recent policy documents have seen it as China as a competitor, but also it's an economic a player, but also a competitor and systemic rival. In space, I think it's really important that we recall that there's different elements. We can look at industrial policy, and certainly if you look at the strategy, for instance, we see the space industry and the value chain as something important, and I think that's something we should always look at also in economic terms. But I think if I maybe just take the perspective of looking at what I mentioned earlier on, preventing miscalculation, preventing unintended escalation, especially when we look at elements such as safety, not just security. We really want to make sure that we are not getting into unintended escalation. That means we need a degree of transparency. We need to understand what our competitor is doing, but we also need to keep some, especially on the safety side, some communication channels open to deconflict conjunction events, for instance. So I think there's many facets in that, and I think we'll be seeing much more in the next coming years, especially on that. And I think since you mentioned the trifold interaction, it will probably be subject to discussion. I can't comment on it in detail, but this is something that I'm sure will be subject for discussion for the immediate future.
Great, thank you so much for your answer. I can imagine that this is going to be a very sensitive topic, and it's a limited certain of information that can be provided. Anyway, thank you very much for all your questions and comments. Unfortunately, our time for today is up. Let me once again thank Dr. Peldszus for her insights into the EU space security. Thank you very much for being with us today. And I also, of course, want to thank the rest of you for attending today's guest lecture. I wish you a nice evening or the rest of the day, depending where you are, and hope to see you during our next space security guest lecture that will take place on May 16 with Dr. Dagenit Pajkovsky. Thank you again, and goodbye.